Welcome back. All right, so by popular request, let's do a redraft. Now I'm going to go through the draft in 1980 as it panned out. So Doug Wickenheiser's the number one pick. This was controversial at the time because Denny Savard, Quebec-born, Montreal fans would have wanted Savard, ends up going third. The Winnipeg Jets take Dave Babbage second. Babbage had a nice long career, but I'll say in the redraft, Savard's going to go before Babbage. Larry Murphy, Hall of Famer there. Then there's Darren Veach before Paul Coffey. So the Caps, a little bit of an error there. Rick Lands to the Vancouver Canucks, had a nice career, but he will not be taken in the top 21 here. Fred Arthur, Mike Bullard, who had a good career as well. Jim Fox, the color announcer for the LA Kings. So the Kings came out of this draft with Larry Murphy and Jim Fox. That's the Kings jersey. I think they did well. I do. I think they did pretty well. And then you get into the other side of the board. You have Mike Blaisdell, Rick Wilson, Dennis Sear, Jim Malone, Jerome DuPont, Brad Palmer, Brent Sutter. So Brent Sutter goes 17th. Probably should have gone much higher. And again, we'll get into the redraft here. Barry Peterson, the one that was traded for Cam Neely. Paul Gagne, Steve Patrick, and Mike Stothers. So, without any further ado, in this redraft being as it is, so does Denny Savard go number one? No. In my eyes, the number one draft pick has to be so obviously in purple is my redraft picks, Paul Coffey. Paul Coffey, one of the best roving players of the 80s. A lot of talk about his defense and does he really play defense? You know, your standard question that gets asked of offensive-minded defensemen. But he was so good at what he did. And honestly, when he was out on the ice for the Oilers, it felt like there was 4 forwards on the ice and they would just swarm. So to me, Paul Coffey ends up going to Montreal. And who knows what would have happened to the Oilers dynasty if Paul Coffey hadn't been a member of that team. So at number 2, is that where Denny Savard goes? No. I'm taking another Oiler at number 2. Yari Curry, forward, goes to the Winnipeg Jets. The Winnipeg Jets, of course, would end up with Teemu Selanne about a decade after this draft. But, yeah, Yari Curry, one of the best Finnish players to ever play in the NHL. You might be able to make the argument he was the best, but again, that's a whole argument for another time. Yari Curry, to me, absolutely goes number 2 in this draft. Which takes me to number 3. And yeah, I will say Denny Savard is still a Blackhawk, so if you're a Hawks fan, you're probably going to be okay with that. I would think, especially if you're in around my age range. Denny Savard going number 3 to the Chicago Blackhawks makes the most sense. Denny Savard, a Hall of Famer, so that's 3 Hall of Famers in this class so far. I should probably start annotating these just a little bit. There we go. So number 4, is it still Larry Murphy? That would be the question. Let me just go down the list here. There isn't a goaltender that I would take at that spot. Yeah, that's going to stay the same. So I'm going to say that LA and Chicago got it right. Larry Murphy goes number 4 to the LA Kings. So Murphy's still the 4th one off the board, which takes us to number 5, going to the Washington Capitals. It will not be Darren Veach. So the Hawks had a miss on Jerome DuPont in the first round. However, Steve Larmer was drafted in this draft. He had a nice long run of, consecutive games played, and he was an underrated forward. I've done career videos on all these players on the board so far, but my Larmer one was one of my favorites to put together because it's easy to forget how many points Larmer put up and how good he was. He was legit a pretty solid player at both ends of the ice. And I think for his time, considering all the scoring that was done in the 80s, probably a little bit underrated. So that takes Larmer off the board. So number 6 going to the Edmonton Oilers. Who's going to go there for their dynasty? So number 6. You know what? Brent Sutter. Brent Sutter was an important forward to the New York Islanders. Brent and Dwayne Sutter for those Stanley Cups. Once they came up and played for the Islanders, they were a big part of those wins. You had Brent Sutter to the Oilers. You lose Curry and Coffey. I apologize to Oiler fans for how this is turning out for them, but Brent Sutter is not bad for a consolation prize. So to Vancouver at 7, I kind of feel like Rick Lands stays there, but I'm just kidding. Not Rick Lands. Going at 7 to the Vancouver Canucks. So another 1,000-point scorer. Would have been interesting if Bernie Nichols had been drafted by the Vancouver Canucks at 7. So Bernie Nichols to the Canucks, meaning the Kings had a pretty good draft that year. You get Fox, you get Murphy, and you get Nichols. This is what happens when you only have 21 teams and you have a pretty deep draft class. You get a bunch of good players. So yeah, Bernie Nichols going 7th to the Vancouver Canucks. He, of course, had that 150-point season the first year Gretzky was playing with the Kings, and ended up with over 1,000 points in his career. Bounced around a little bit in the league towards the end, but he was a very solid player in his own right. Plus, played down the middle. And the Canucks absolutely could have used help down the middle. They did draft a center that ends up being in the top 21 on this, but I'll take Nichols ahead of the player that I'm going to have there for the Canucks. Next up is Hartford. So going to the Hartford Whalers, first goaltender. Sorry, Oilers fans. I now have Andy Moog with the Hartford Whalers. So breaking up the Oilers dynasty as I have, you've got Coffey to Montreal, Curry to Winnipeg, and Moog to Hartford. The Hartford Whalers, I think, would have benefited greatly from Andy Moog. Moog is honestly one of my top 5 favorite goaltenders of all time. I really, loved him in Boston. I liked him in Edmonton as well. And it was fun to watch him in Dallas after he was done with Boston as well. So Moog had a nice long career, ton of wins, and I think that's where he goes in this redraft. Going number 9, do I go with another goaltender? Yep, I think I do. So Pittsburgh at this point drafts a goaltender at 9. Kelly Hrudey. Kelly Hrudey, of course, of Hockey Night in Canada. I have him going to the Pittsburgh Penguins. He would have been a solid goaltender for them. And again, much like Hartford, Pittsburgh could have used the goaltending of Kelly Hrudey at points during the 80s. The Penguins had some lean times before Mario Lemieux took them to the promised land in the early 90s. And of course, they had Barrasso for that. But maybe if you have Hrudey on that team that whole time, maybe you don't need to go out and get Tom Barrasso. Of course, then he probably doesn't end up in LA. You don't have him with the Kings, with Gretzky and all that. But again, it's just fun to do redrafts just to see where guys end up. Number 10, going to the LA Kings. Defenseman, dropping from 2, but still a very solid career. Dave Babich. Babich, of course, I've met him. Very nice guy. And always been cordial as far as I've seen in retirement, but also as a player. Very popular as a player, popular with the fans, and for good reason. Dave Babich, yep, still top 10 in that draft class. That's a solid top 10. That is a really strong top 10. The 1980 draft, of course, overshadowed a bit by the 1979 draft, which was stacked, and I already did the redraft for that draft. So now we go into number 11. And at 11, I'm going to go with a defenseman here. Doug Lidster was a solid D-man in the NHL for roughly 15 years. Ends up winning a Stanley Cup with the New York Rangers. Vancouver kind of played him into the ground before that. But yeah, Doug Lidster, really, really solid defenseman. Was the best defenseman I thought the Canucks had right up until he left and ended up winning a Stanley Cup with the New York Rangers against Vancouver. But we can forget about that for now. I'm going to have a Lidster at number 11. At number 12... this is where it kind of goes back and forth. Arguments can be made for others as well. At 12, to St. Louis. So the 80s weren't exactly a decade known for defensive forwards. Troy Murray was one of the better defensive forwards of the 80s. Solid points producer as well. I think he had 99 points as his career high. So almost 100, not quite. But Troy Murray was better known for the defensive aspect of the game, really solid center. And yeah, so he goes to St. Louis in this draft instead of Chicago. So for fans old enough to remember, they might look at that and say, that's not right. But in this case, just for a redraft, it's no big deal. It's fine. And this redraft is from far enough back that there won't be that many people watching that necessarily get all kind of, wait a minute, what? Unless you're an Oiler fan looking at that dynasty and saying, wow, Shannon did this just to break up the dynasty. Maybe. Then going at number 13 to the Calgary Flames. And this one's a bit of a difficulty too, because a lot of these players are really close to one another. Very close. I'm going to go with a defenseman that actually did play for Calgary. So we talked about Troy Murray as a defensive forward. Steve Conroy, solid defensive defenseman. Nice long career for Conroy as well. I thought about doing a career video on him a few days ago, actually. I was looking him up kind of when I was putting together the list for this. And so there may be a Steve Conroy video in the future on this channel. But yeah, I'm going to put Conroy at 13. At 14, another goaltender going to the Rangers. Don Beaupre. Beaupre, of course, a hero in Minnesota. And a very good goaltender when they had Beaupre and Meloche in Minnesota. It was a pretty solid tandem. So at 14, I have Beaupre, meaning that we have 3 goaltenders in the top 14 in this draft, and there were no goaltenders drafted in the first round that year. And this is standard. This is something that when we do redrafts, we often see goaltenders going much higher, but they may not have been the first goaltender taken in that draft. It is so hard to project which goaltenders are necessarily going to be stars in the NHL. But there's Beaupre. Next up, going at 15... I'm tempted to put that player up. Yeah, I'm going to go with to Chicago. Brian Mullen. Solid workhorse, like a brick house or a workhouse. Anyways, Brian Mullen, I just invent a word. Why not? Sure. Brian Mullen, solid forward, top 6 through most of his career. Overshadowed by another guy named Mullen that goes by the name Joe. But yeah, Brian Mullen in his own right was a solid player. And so, yeah, to Chicago at 15, why not? That works. Moving on to 16, going to the Minnesota North Stars. A bit of a shortened career for Jim Fox. But when he was in his prime, Fox was excellent. Above a point per game. It is the 80s. That is to be taken with a grain of salt. But I like Jim Fox. Solid forward. Which brings us down to number 17. Speaking of players who in their prime were pretty good, Mike Bullard. Bullard was one of these oddities, too, that he was a really good player, and then all of a sudden just his career fell off. But there's enough good years there that I still think that Bullard, if you did a redraft, would fall into this spot. And yet I could make the argument for Bullard as high as 13. Like from 13 through 17, this is just kind of, well, yeah, I'll take him there. But you can make the argument, I think, and maybe you could put Bullard ahead of Murray, but I wouldn't. But yeah, Bullard, good, solid, top 6 forward, center as well, and had some really good years. I believe he eclipsed 100 points at one mark. And I understand, too, people would say, well, it was the 80s. Well, yeah, there was a lot of 100-point scores, but still, it's impressive when that happens. Number 18, going to the Boston Bruins. Stays the same. Barry Peterson. So Peterson, of course, is known for the fact that, the Canucks traded Neely and a first-round pick in order to get Peterson. At the time the Canucks made that trade, it was about getting depth down the middle. They traded a winger. They traded a draft pick. Well, they don't need draft picks. They need playoffs. And stop me if you've heard this before. But Peterson was a solid center who was coming off of some very good years in Boston. It's just his career kind of faltered in Vancouver, comparatively speaking. And Cam Neely became a pretty big deal. So Peterson ends up getting, I think, a lot more flack than he necessarily deserves. I think I've already done a career video on Barry Peterson. If I haven't, I have to rectify that. But yeah, Peterson Probably better than people remember because of the fact he's traded for Neely, which, yes, is a very lopsided deal. And then they throw in a draft pick that becomes Glenn Wesley. That just, no. No. That might be where I get the whole don't trade first rounders from, is from that year. Number 19, going to the Colorado Rockies. I looked. I could not find a Colorado Rockies magnet. I know I have one somewhere in here. Could not find it. Many apologies. But going to the Rockies, instead of Paul Gagne, I mentioned defensive forwards. Tom Fergus was definitely solid defensively. Had some very good years there as well. And so I have Tom Fergus going at 19th to the Colorado Rockies, who would become the New Jersey Devils just a couple of short years after that. So this was really, you know, a decent pickup for the Rockies that they get Gagne at 19. Gagne ended up having a few good years in there, but Fergus would be the better pick. And of course, the pick that was Montreal's at 1 was originally Colorado's. So the Rockies would have picked it first, could have picked Yari Curry, who went 69th that year. Yeah, commence giggling. But the reality is that was a big part of what was wrong with Colorado, was trading out draft picks looking to get better when those draft picks would have made them better in the first place. So yeah, Fergus goes there. And then at 20, and there's some interchangeability here with some of these guys, especially looking back from this far on. Mark Osborne, number 20 to the Buffalo Sabres instead of Steve Patrick. So for the Sabres, Steve Patrick ends up playing some games, and you know he had a decent enough career as a pro, not worthy of that first round pick ahead of Mark Osborne, and yeah, so. And he has a kid in the NHL you may have heard of. But at any rate, yeah, Mark Osborne, number 20 to the Buffalo Sabres, which rounds out to number 21. Mike Stothers was originally taken a defenseman by Philadelphia. So instead, I'm going to have, and I've got some names here, because I make sure I've got extra names on here. And yep. So the Canucks got a hit in this draft in Patrick Sundstrom. Patrick Sundstrom, solid player, really, you know, not a bad career at all, and would end up playing with the New Jersey Devils as well. Patrick Sundstrom ends up going at 21st to the Philadelphia Flyers. So there you go. There's a redraft for you. Honorable mentions, because I should do the honorable mentions about the players that I didn't actually draft in this one, would go to Craig Muni, defenseman. Bob McGill, tough as nails, defenseman. Aaron Broughton, forward, overshadowed by Neil Broughton. Randy Cunneyworth, nice long career for him. And defensive defenseman Craig Ludwig, who ended up recording a lot of penalty minutes in his career, as well as many of the players out of this draft class. I may do a video, too, on what I think was the toughest draft class. I don't think I've done that before. I should. And don't be surprised when a lot of the 70s and 80s drafts end up getting the preferential treatment, because that's when you have, you know, really the enforcers became a selling point for the National Hockey League, late 70s, early 80s especially. So there you go. There's your redraft. First redraft of the summer. Got through it painlessly. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.